memory block as to what we did. Did we discuss the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva last week? If anyone remembers, we did? Okay, so just again, we're continuing a little bit of a discussion about the counting of the Omer. And again, the word Omer is just a measure of barley, or a measure of grain. It happened to be that an Omer of barley was brought as a sacrifice on the second day of Pesach. And starting from that time, we count the days to the giving of the Torah, which is Shavuos, that's 49 days, and Shavuos is day number 50. So really, the phrase, the counting of the Omer, actually does not make grammatical sense. It's really the counting from the Omer, from the time that you brought the Omer offering. And the basic idea, we said last week, and I'm sure you've heard it in other classes as well, is that Pesach is the holiday of freedom, Zaman Cherusenu, and Shavuos is the holiday of Torah, submission to God, and freedom is meaningless unless it's connected to accepting the yoke of heaven, and that is why the Omer offering is barley, which was commonly given to animals, and on Shavuos we bring wheat bread, which is eaten by human beings, because when you go from freedom to Torah, you're really moving from animal liberation to human dignity, right? And that's really the message, that we're connecting. In fact, the Ramban actually says that the Omer period is like a Chol HaMoed, connecting two parts of the same holiday. Pesach and Shavuos are fundamentally the same holiday, because the freedom of Pesach was in order that we should accept HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah. Now, I think I mentioned last week, again, I just don't remember. Somehow my memory got wiped out last week. I'm not sure why. But there is a big machlokas if the Omer counting today is a Torah commandment or rabbinic commandment, because some authorities connect it to the bringing of the Omer offering, and if we don't have that, it's only a rabbinic law to remember the temple. Others say that it is d'oraisa even today. That's a machlokas among the Meforshim. But I want to point out another aspect of the Omer that people sometimes don't realize, and that is the bringing of the Omer permits the consumption of the grain of the new year. We're going to read in this week's parsha, the parsha of the week coming up, that there's an Isur in the Torah called Chadash. Chadash means new grain. New grain, right now, but when I say the word grain, I mean something very specific. It means the 5 species of grain. So that would be wheat, barley, oats, rye, spelt. That's very important. The concept of the 5 grains are extremely important because, number one, those are the grains that become chametz. Number 2, those are the grains you can make matzah out of. You can't make matzah out of anything other than the 5 grains. Those are the grains for which you recite hamotzi if it's bread. Those are the grains in which you recite mizonos if it's cake. Those are the grains that you either say Birkat HaMazon or Al HaMichya. Now, there's a lot of things that modern society calls grains that are not halachically grains. For example, corn is not halachically a grain. Corn is a vegetable. You make borei pri ha'adama. Rice is also not a grain, although you make Al HaMichya, and it's unique, but there's no... I'm sorry, you make mizonos on it. You don't make Al HaMichya, you don't bench. Buckwheat, even though it has the word wheat in it. Buckwheat, quinoa, all of that stuff is not grain. It may be for Pesach, and some of it might fall under kidneyos for Ashkenazim, but it's not grains. So, the same way that these 5 grains are very distinguished in all of these other areas, this is also relevant for the Isur of Chadash. There's an Isur d'oraisa to eat the new grain of the year until the Korban HaOmer is brought. Once the Korban HaOmer is brought on the second day of Pesach, the Korban HaOmer permits the consumption of Chadash. Now, it's a little complicated because the way it works is the following. First, I'm going to talk about when there's a Beis HaMikdash, then we'll talk about today. When there's a Beis HaMikdash, any grain that took root in the ground, that was already rooted in the ground before the second day of Pesach, was covered by the bringing of the Omer. Now, what do I mean by rooted in the ground? So Chazal basically say that when you plant a seed, it takes a few days till it actually gets roots. And for grain, it's like 2 weeks. So essentially, we could say the following. Any grain that was planted in the ground 2 weeks before Pesach, so it took root by the second day of Pesach, will be covered by the Omer. So even though it doesn't grow and it's not harvested till after Pesach, halachically it is called old grain because it predated the Omer. And Kal V'chomer, if it was already harvested and it grew before Pesach, the Omer covers it. So what does the Omer not cover? It does not cover grain that was planted after Pesach, or even grain that was planted before Pesach, but it didn't have the 2 weeks. The Omer doesn't cover that. So when are you allowed to eat that grain? Only next year. Next year's Omer will cover it, because vis-a-vis next year's Omer, it already had taken root before. Meaning all Chadash eventually becomes old. Because if it's not going to be mutter this year, it'll be mutter next year. Okay, this is called the din of Chadash. And eating Chadash is an Isur Chadash. It's in the Torah. And once the Omer permits it, it is called Yashar. It is now called old grain. Okay, so Chadash, and the Omer, therefore, is Matir. The Omer is Matir Chadash. Now, you may ask me a simple question. Well, how do people, if you live in Tel Aviv, right, how would you know when you can eat your Chadash? Because you don't know when they bring. If you lived in Yerushalayim, you could check when they brought the Omer Korban in the Beis HaMikdash. But if you didn't live in Yerushalayim and they didn't have faxes or telephones or emails, not even WhatsApp groups, so how would they know? So the Gemara says there was a general rule that in the Beis HaMikdash they never brought the Omer offering later than the middle of the day. Sometimes they brought it earlier, but they never brought it later. So if I'm in Yerushalayim and I know they brought the Omer at 10 o'clock in the morning, I could eat my grain 10 o'clock in the morning. But if I lived in Tel Aviv and I didn't know when they brought the Omer, I would have to wait until the middle of the day of the 16th of Nisan, first day of Chol HaMoed, second day of Pesach. And as soon as it's noon, whether noon is ladaf at 12, halachic noon is the middle of the day, meaning the midpoint between sunrise and sunset. When the sun is direct, like true noon astronomically, is when the sun is directly over your head. Now, based on time zones and the like, that can sometimes be 11:30, a quarter to 12, 12:15, or 12:30, based on the clock, which is not exact. But if you actually had it in a sundial, an astronomically precise clock, high noon is sun is directly overhead. So if you're in Tel Aviv, you would be allowed to eat your new grain when the sun is directly overhead, because for sure in the Beis HaMikdash, they did not delay the Omer beyond that point. Okay. So now I'm going to ask a very simple question. If you're not allowed to eat Chadash until the Omer is brought, today we have not yet merited the Beis HaMikdash. We didn't bring the Omer this year. So how can we ever eat the new grain? In fact, no grain should be mutter because all of it, none of it, unless you have grain dating from before the year 70, all of the grain that has grown since the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash has not had an Omer offering to permit it. So how can I eat that grain? 5 species of grain. How can I eat that grain? So the answer is the Gemara gives us a tremendously important loophole. The Gemara says there are 2 ways that the Chadash gets mutter. When there's a Beis Hamikdash, the Chadash is mutter only if an actual Omer sacrifice is brought. But the Gemara has a drasha based on psukim that when there is no actual Omer sacrifice brought, it is the beginning of the day that permits it. In other words, the Omer is, what day is the Omer brought? The 16th of Nisan, 2nd day of Pesach. In Chutz La'aretz, that's a Yom Tov, and here it's Chol HaMoed. So when you have a Beis Hamikdash, you have to wait until the bringing of the Omer. When there's no Beis Hamikdash, the crack of dawn permits it. Meaning the crack of dawn of the 16th of Nisan now allows me to eat the Chadash, the grain that took root before that day. Now, one little addition though. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the great rabbis in the aftermath of the Churban Beis Hamikdash, enacted that you have to wait one more day. You have to wait until the morning of the 17th of Nisan. And the reason he gave is a very interesting reason. Because the following. When there is a Beis Hamikdash, I can't eat the new grain until the Omer is brought, which might be as late as 12 noon. Now, if I got into the habit, when there's no Beis Hamikdash, of eating at the crack of dawn, then what's going to happen if next year the Beis Hamikdash is built, and I'm supposed to wait until 12, but I'm going to eat at the crack of dawn? So he says, therefore, don't eat it that day at all. Eat it the morning of the 17th. And then when the temple is built, you'll be able to eat it earlier, the afternoon of the 16th. But if we let you eat it earlier when the temple is not built, then when the temple is built, you might make a mistake and eat it earlier than you can. So again, in this takana was mushrash, embedded the amuna as mehera ibana hamikdash, that the temple will be rebuilt very, very, very quickly, and therefore we don't want to allow you to eat the chadash on the morning of the 16th, lest next year we have a Beis Hamikdash and you'll be eating it before the Omer was brought. Of course, there's an interesting question. So why does he have to wait until the morning of the next day? If the Omer is never brought later than noon, he just should have said, can't eat chadash until noon of the 16th, because that's going to cover when the temple is rebuilt. And that's a good question. I don't want to go into it now. The Gemara goes into different problems there. But the bottom line, therefore, is that even today, you are not allowed to eat chadash, new grain, and new grain is defined as grain that did not take root before Pesach, until the morning of the 17th of Nisan. So, here's the issue. Is this anything? This is a halacha. This is an absolute halacha. If you're a farmer, you have to be aware of this. There is an Isur Chadash. Is this something you have to be worried about? So first of all, let me make an obvious point. This time of year, for sure, there's no problem, because think about this. Any bread, cookies, pasta, cake that you're eating must have been, Pesach, we just said this, must have been from grain that was even harvested before Pesach. Because how did it reach market? So by definition, the day of the Omer mattered it, permitted it. So in reality, from Pesach to around Sukkot, there is no problem of potential chadash reaching the marketplace, because any grain product that reaches the marketplace in this period of time was already harvested before Pesach. and therefore it's covered by the heter. So when is there a potential problem? The potential problem starts around Sukkot time. And the reason is because by the time, I'm giving you approximate dates, by the time Sukkot comes around, you could already have grain that was planted after Pesach. So it was not covered by the heter of the Omer. And that grain is not going to be mutter to eat until next Omer. So if you keep the laws of Chadash as you should, your problem is grain products from Sukkot to Pesach, not grain products from Pesach to Sukkot. Everyone follows that. So this is not a problematic problem. Okay. But my question still is, okay, so do I have to worry about this? When Sukkot comes and we potentially have Chadash grain, do I have to worry about it? So Baruch Hashem, by and large, you do not have to worry about it because this is subsumed in whatever hashgacha you rely upon. Meaning, if you buy any grain product with a hashgacha, whatever hashgacha you rely upon, whether it's Eda Charedes, Badatz, or Reuben, or whatever it is. So they make sure that nothing reaches the market. That's Chadash. So between Sukkot and Pesach, the only grain products they'll put out are stuff that was grown before Pesach. And they won't allow the release of the new grain till after Pesach. Okay? Which means, for the most part, Chadash is an academic concern for the kosher consumer because the hashgachos supervise it. Okay? Just like Truma.
That supervisor that we're using, that's kosher, like, surveillance person?
Well, anyone that you rely upon, meaning if it's a reliable hashgacha.
What's hashgacha?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hashgacha means supervision.
Okay.
So you buy things with supervisions, right? So one of the things the supervision will cover is they will not introduce the chadash, the new grain, into the marketplace. It'll be stored up in a warehouse until. So for the most part, you don't have to start asking anybody, oh, is this chadash or not? But in America, there actually is a problem. Let me give you a little background on this. We know that most agricultural mitzvot only apply to the land of Israel. They don't apply outside of Israel. So, for example, taking the truma that you give to the Kohen, taking the maser, the tithes that you give to the Levi, a shemitah, observing the sabbatical year. That only applies in Eretz Yisrael. In Chutz La'aretz, you don't have that problem. That's why, by the way, the kashrus is more difficult in Israel. Because here in Israel, in America, I can buy apples and bananas without rabbinic supervision. Because as long as it's kosher, it's kosher. In Eretz Yisrael, I need supervision even on a banana to be sure that the tithes were taken. Unless I take it myself, which you can do, but a lot of people are not familiar with that. Maybe we'll cover that later. So this is a famous rule in the Talmud, that most mitzvos that are connected to the soil, to the ground, to the agricultural cycle, only apply to the land of Israel, they're not applied outside of Israel. However, so let's ask about Chadash. So Chadash, this rule that you can't eat the new grain, does that apply only to the grain of Israel? Or does it even apply to the grain of Chutz La'aretz? Now, based on the general rule that I told you, this shouldn't be a problem with Chutz La'aretz because Chadash is connected to agriculture. But in truth, it's a machlokas in the Gemara, and there is an opinion who's strict and actually says Chadash does apply even outside of Israel, based on the fact that in Parshas Emor, this week's Parsha, when it talks about Chadash, it uses a bit of an unusual phrase. It says, you shall keep the law of Chadash b'chol moshvoseichem, in all of your settlements. That's a little superfluous. But one opinion says that means even when you're living outside of Israel. So I don't want to go into all of the technical background, but let me just say that there's a huge machlokas among the poskim whether Chadash applies outside of Israel or Chadash does not apply outside of Israel. Now, here is the thing. For various reasons, many American hashgachos follow the lenient view. The OU, for example. When the OU certifies grain products that were made from Chutz La'aretz grain, they do not certify that it's from the old year. Meaning they will allow, between Sukkot and Pesach, they will allow Chadash to be sold under their supervision because they rely on the lenient view, which they have the right to do, but you need to know they're only that now. The problem is that many B'nai Torah, many more devout people, try to be strict on this law. And you need to know that although in Eretz Yisrael, where for sure there's an Isur of Chadash, so any reputable supervision will ensure that you're not getting Chadash. In the United States or other countries, that's not necessarily the case because even reputable supervisions do not warrant Chadash because they're following a lenient view. So if you are a person who wants to be strict in this matter, and I'll discuss whether you should be in a moment, it turns out you need to make further inquiry. Now, what some people do is the following. After Pesach, they buy a year's worth of grain product. Meaning after Pesach, you know that this is not Chadash. So they buy enough to cover them until next Pesach. So if you walk into a person's basement, it'll look like a mini supermarket, look like a makolet. There'll be like, whatever it is, 30 packages of spaghetti and, 15 packages of chocolate chip cookies, whatever it would be. In other words, the way they get around the problem is they do all of their buying between Pesach and Sukkot to cover the second half year, and that way they know they don't have a problem. Another way, which is a bit more sophisticated, is that barcodes can actually tell you, if you know how to read them, which I don't, but it can actually tell you when something was produced. And therefore, the people who keep Yashan, they're familiar with barcodes, and they actually publish magazines that tell you what this barcode means, what that barcode means, and the like. And they have registries and magazines and product lines and everything else. So all I'm suggesting is that if you keep this law of Chadash, so in Eretz Yisrael, where the law is actually stricter, you don't have to worry about it because every hashgacha will cover this. In America, or other countries, because of the leniency of Chutz La'aretz, Chadash is not covered. So if you want to take it on as a chumrah, you need to do your own independent research. Now, that's not. Some hashgachas do cover it. For example, the Star K, which is the Baltimore Vad. I'm from Baltimore. In fact, the head of the Baltimore Vad was my high school Rebbe, Rabbi Breitowitz, a very, very distinguished posek. So I think they will not certify any grain product that is Chadash. So you have to be a little educated, meaning that it creates a little bit of a complication and the like. But the OU does not certify it for that. Now, let me compare the chumrah, meaning if you're in America and you think that Chadash is too hard for you to keep and you don't keep it, you have a basis to follow it. But let me compare it with another chumrah and ask you, let's talk about Chalav Yisrael for a moment, which is not our topic, but you'll see a certain similarity. What is Chalav Yisrael? This is a Mishnah. It goes all the way back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says a Jew is not allowed to drink milk unless a Jewish person witnessed the milking of the animal. The Jewish person doesn't have to milk the animal. A guy can milk the animal, but a Jew has to witness the milking of the animal. So Chalav Yisrael means simply milk that was witnessed by a Jew. So the Mishnah says, if the milking was not witnessed by a Jew, you're not allowed to drink that milk. That's called Chalav Akum, the Chalav of a Goy. Now, question is, why is that so? I mean, milk is kosher. Milk of a cow is kosher. What's the problem that I didn't see, a Jew did not see the milking? So the Gemara says it's a gezerah, it's a decree, because the rabbis were afraid that surreptitiously the non-Jewish milker might slip in some non-kosher milk, right? There is milk that's not kosher. Pig milk is not kosher. Donkey milk is not kosher. Camel milk is not kosher. I mean, they're, non-kosher animals have milk too if they're mammals, right? I mean, you never heard of elephant milk, but there must be elephant milk too, not kosher. So the rabbis were afraid of adulteration, and therefore they prohibited milk unless it's Chalav Yisrael. Now, many people are very strict on this rule even today, Chabad in particular. Now, I have to say that to get Chalav Yisrael was not always a very easy thing. In places like New York, big Jewish communities, okay, Chalav Yisrael was fairly easy. But if you're a Chabad Shaliach in the middle of Montana or whatever it is, and milk spoils very quickly, so you order your milk from New York or something, or even Chicago, it's going to spoil. So very often the Shaliach has to go to the farm 4 o'clock in the morning and either do his own milking or watch the farmer milk. I mean, that's what you do. In other words, if you're keeping Chalav Yisrael in a place that does not have like an established Jewish community, you go to the farm and you get your daily milk that way. Okay, now, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the great posek of the 20th century, had a very interesting leniency. Because, as you know, there are many Orthodox Jews, we say, who don't keep Chalav Yisrael. They'll just buy regular milk. And the question you might ask is there any hedger for what they're doing? The Mishnah, it's not like a later thing, the Mishnah says you have to have Chalav Yisrael. So how can they buy unsupervised milk? Is there a hedger? So Rav Moshe Feinstein, although he himself only kept Chalav Yisrael, and he very much said people should keep Chalav Yisrael, he did say that. But he said there is a heter, and the heter is the following. When you have a government inspection system, state and federal government, that inspects milk for purity, for bacteria, and if they discover adulteration in any way, usually it'll be water. It's not going to be pig milk or whatever, but they look for adulteration. If they discover the adulteration, the farmer will not only be fined, but he might go to jail. The farmer or the milker is afraid to tamper with the milk. So Rav Feinstein said that took the place of a Jewish person watching the milk. And it would be mutter, therefore, according to the strict halacha, Rav Moshe said it would be mutter to buy non-Chalav Yisrael in places where there is governmental inspection against adulteration. Now, I want to point out that, number one, Rav Moshe himself said that a God-fearing person should try to be strict. Okay? But number two, it's also important to understand that Rav Moshe's heter is not worldwide. Rav Moshe's dispensation is only going to apply when you have a government system. So, for example, if you're traveling in China or Sahara Desert and they give you some milk to drink, you don't know what they do. They could have put in llama milk, camel milk, whatever. In other words, not every place in the world has, governmental supervision. There's a lot of places, Afghanistan or whatever it is, where nobody's watching anything. So there, the halacha is going to go back to its original point. Now, as you know, even though the Rebbe had tremendous respect for Moshe, and indeed Moshe had tremendous respect for the Rebbe, they were very close. But as you know, Chabad is actually very strict on Chalav Yisrael. Of course, even Moshe said one should be strict too. And Chabad does not go for any leniencies here, which is sometimes hard because remember, Chalav Yisrael is not only milk; it includes cheese, it includes ice cream, it includes chocolate, or a regular Hershey bar. Right? Everyone knows Hershey bars are kosher, right? But if you keep Chalav Yisrael, you have to have a Hershey bar. Right? Very. It's a very strict halacha.
So it can be a dairy product can be kosher, but not halal Israel.
Yeah, so that's what I want to point out. I want to point out, similar to Chadash, many mainstream U.S. hashgachot, such as the OU, do not certify for Chalav Yisrael. Mm-hmm. So that's why Hershey's will have an OU. But if you keep Chalav Yisrael, this is another example where sometimes you have to do your own investigation because the hashgacha does not cover it because the hashgacha follows Rav Moshe Feinstein's lenient rule. Okay? So the same way in America, a hashgacha may not cover Chadash. A hashgacha in America does not cover Chalav Yisrael. And that's why there's an additional requirement. Now, there are hashgachas that do. There are, for example, the OK. The OK actually started off as a Chabad hashgacha, or Bero Levi. The OK will only certify Chalav Yisrael. The Star K will only certify Chalav Yisrael. So you need to know this. You just need to know what is being certified, what are the standards of the hashgacha. Now, I'm not impugning the OU. I mean, I use the OU all the time. I'm just informing you that the OU does not certify that a dairy product, is Chalav Yisrael. Now, another thing about Chalav Yisrael that's interesting is any Israeli certification, any dairy certification of Rabbanut or any hashgacha is only Chalav Yisrael. Okay? And that's even Rabbanut, which many people don't use. A plain Rabbanut hashgacha is only Chalav Yisrael. But the Rabbanut has another twist, which again Chabad does not accept. That is, the Rabbanut has an old psak going back to the 1930s from Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank was a very great, he was the Rav of Yerushalayim and a very great posek. And he took the position that the laws of Chalav Yisrael only apply to liquid milk, even if it's mixed into a product. It does not apply to powdered milk. So the Rabbanut will certify as acceptable products that contain powdered milk, even though the milk was not Chalav Yisrael. And that is the difference between Ben & Jerry's and Haagen-Dazs. Now, both Ben & Jerry's ice cream and Haagen-Dazs both have an OU, or some other cupcake, some hashgacha. But you'll notice from stores, in religious stores, they sell Ben & Jerry's, but they don't sell Haagen-Dazs. You can get Haagen-Dazs in, stores that are not religious. You can actually get Haagen-Dazs with the OU. Yeah. So what's the difference? The difference is very simple. Ben & Jerry's uses powdered milk. Therefore, under the Rabbanut standard, it doesn't have to be Chalav Yisrael. So the Rabbanut will allow it to be sold in their kosher stores. Haagen-Dazs is a more luxury ice cream. They only use whole milk. It has an OU certification because the OU does not certify for Chalav Yisrael, but it's not Chalav Yisrael. And therefore, the Rabbanut will not allow Haagen-Dazs to be sold in its store. So, when you're in America, therefore, if you don't keep Chalav Yisrael, I'll talk about it, then you can have Haagen-Dazs. It's under OU supervision, kosher. If you keep Chalav Yisrael, you cannot. But Ben & Jerry's, it depends. If you don't keep Chalav Yisrael, for sure you could. It's under hashgacha. If you keep Chalav Yisrael, it then depends whether you follow the Rabbanut's leniency of powdered milk. Now Chabad is both machmir on Chalav Yisrael, and they don't accept the leniency of powdered milk. So as a result, no Haagen-Dazs and no Ben and Jerry's. Except in Israel, there is a Ben and Jerry's that's made locally. That's from Chalav Yisrael, so that's called Mahadrin. But the Ben and Jerry's that's imported from the U.S. is powdered, non-Chalav Yisrael milk. Okay, that's a little bit of the history. But as I say, there is a Ben and Jerry's that's Mahadrin that's produced here, and that actually is Chalav Yisrael.
Is it powdered or real?
It's probably still powdered, but they it's Chalav Yisrael. Okay, now.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Like in this new industrial society where like thousands of cows get milked by machines, like how many Jews per cow?
Yeah, that's a good, that's a good question. So the principle basically is, and maybe I misstated it when I said a Jew has to see the milking. That's not necessarily true. But it means a Jew has to be somebody who walks in and out at any point. So if you're a milker, you're afraid any moment. So you have a mashgiach, maybe in a giant room, he pops in, he looks around. So he doesn't have to see the actual milking. Now, one interesting issue, which again Chabad is strict on, but there's a leniency, is whether video cameras can satisfy the Chalav Yisrael requirement. Because some of these dairies are located, particularly in the United States, which is a big country, they're located really in the middle of the sticks, middle of nowhere. And they do the milking, 3 a.m. in the morning. And it's hard to get a rabbi out there. I mean, rabbis do it, but, it's not easy. So the thought was, let's have a video feed so everything is recorded, and the milkers know that everything they do is watched and recorded, and that should satisfy Chalav Yisrael because they're afraid to do anything because they're being watched. So some rabbis have allowed that to be called Chalav Yisrael, as long as there's a Jewish rabbi who potentially could be watching it. But I think Chabad said you need a live presence. So the different, meaning even within Chalav Yisrael there are going to be different definitions. Now, but Moshe Feinstein was lenient on Chalav Yisrael, but he himself always kept it. Like they tell the story, it's a funny story a little bit. You see, if you're a gadol, you got to be very careful because people are watching you like a hawk. That there were two Chalav Yisrael companies in New York for many years. One was J&J, which I think is actually a Chabad company, J&J. They make milk, halachic, all dairy stuff. And the other was Golden Flow. Two companies, both of which Chalav Yisrael. So Rav Moshe Feinstein was at a bris, and he went over to pour some milk in his cup of coffee. He picked up the Golden Flow container, looked at it, put it down, then picked up the J&J container and poured the milk from the J&J container. So people were very, very concerned. Why did he put down the Golden Flow? Did he consider Golden Flow not to be Chalav Yisrael? And people stopped buying Golden Flow. And finally somebody asked for Moshe, why did you put down the Golden Flow? He said, the container was empty. But you see, people interpret it. It's not kosher enough. So you got to, when you're at a certain level, you got to be very, very careful about every single thing. Okay, now the reason why did I digress on bringing Chalav Yisrael? Because essentially, I mentioned to you two chumros, two stringencies, which the mainstream hashgachos will certify as kosher, even though the stringency was not met. One was something not being Chalav Yisrael, and the other is something being Chadash. So, let's imagine your mindset is, I'm willing to take on one extra thing, but not two extra things. Okay, I want to be a little stricter in kashrus. So what should I take on? Should I take on Chalav Yisrael? or should I take on Chadash? So the truth of the matter is, although Chalav Yisrael is more well known, probably Chadash would probably be the more important thing to be strict on. And the reason is because Chalav Yisrael for sure is only a rabbinic requirement. The prohibition of Chadash may potentially be a Torah requirement, if you hold that it applies Chutz La'aretz, which is itself the Machlokas. So it is interesting. Now I think the Chabad answer would be Chalav Yisrael would be, they consider to be more important. I don't want to tell you what to do, but I think outside of Chabad, the B'nai Yeshiva are actually stricter on Chadash than they would be on Chalav Yisrael. So there's something to be aware of. Again, this part of the year, you have no problems anywhere. The problem is going to be between Sukkot and Pesach. Okay? And after Pesach, whatever was there before Pesach will be mutter, with the day, the 17th of Nisan coming. Okay? So that's the problem of Chadash and Yashan, and that only applies to the 5 grains, wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. It does not apply to corn, it does not apply to rice, buckwheat, quinoa, or any of that other stuff. Now, let me just point out that for Pesach, there's another problem with milk. It has nothing to do with Chalav Yisrael. And that is milk has a problem primarily in the additives, because most milk is vitamin enriched. And the vitamin they put in milk is vitamin D. Vitamin D is made from a grain extract. So vitamin D is often chametz. Vitamin D is often chametz. So any milk you buy for Pesach either is certified kosher Pesach, or many people will be lenient if you buy it before Pesach. You can use it on Pesach based on the following theory. Let me explain the theory. The theory is a little complicated. The percentage of vitamin D in the milk is less than 1 part in 60. Meaning you have more than 60 times milk. Now, there is a general rule in halacha that treif, non-kosher, is nullified if it's less than 1 part in 60. So, for example, if a little bit of milk fell into a meat soup, that's 60 times more, you're allowed to eat the soup. If a little bit of meat gravy went into a milk soup, same thing. And not only if it's meat and milk, but even if it's kosher treif, if a little bit of pork juice went into a coat by accident, of course, went into it. So there is a general rule called nullification in 60. The Hebrew phrase is batel b'shishim. And of course, you can't do it on purpose. You can't deliberately pour milk into your soup, but these are accidents. This law is for accidents. And the logic of batel b'shishim is based on taste. Chazal had a presumption that if it's 60 times whatever fell in, you're not going to be able to taste it. Now, there are some cases which are exceptions to batel b'shishim, where there's no nullification at all. And one of those exceptions is chametz. That even if the smallest bit of chametz is mixed into 1,000 times non-chametz, can't eat it. But that's only if the chametz fell in during Pesach. But if the chametz fell in before Pesach, it is nullified in 60. Therefore, if I get my milk before Pesach, even if it has vitamin D, which is a malted barley grain extract, it will be nullified in 60 or more parts of milk, but I can't buy it during Pesach unless it's certified. If it's certified, I could, because that means the chametz was not added. And that's why you'll find a difference between before Pesach and after Pesach, because during Pesach we don't have the leniency of nullification in 60. Before Pesach we do. Yeah, okay? So that's a separate problem. There's nothing to do with Chalav Yisrael, that's a problem of Chametz in one case.
But if this rule is for accidents,
Yeah.
and in the case of this milk with vitamin D that's clearly deliberately
Yeah.
put into the
Yeah.
milk, why is
Yeah,
that?
that's a very, very excellent question. But if the assumption is that the dairy was a non-Jewish company, so even if they put it in purpose, vis-a-vis me, the consumer, it's an accident, meaning I did not intend to take it back. In other words, they didn't put in the vitamin D because of batal bashisha. They put in the vitamin D for nutritional value. So vis-a-vis me, I can treat that as an accident because there was no intention to take advantage of the halacha that way. Okay? Another issue where we don't say batal bashisha, nothing to do with this, is bugs. Right? As you know, insects in leafy vegetables
Or raspberries.
or fruits can be a very, very, very serious problem. If you eat one little ant, I don't mean your uncle's wife here, but your aunt. I say aunt anyway, but if you eat one little, but for Chicago people, I have to clarify this. If you eat one little ant, you can get 5 sets of lashes, 5 prohibitions. But here's the question. The question becomes, yeah, but if I have a big salad and there's some little insect there that I can't even see, surely I have 60 times the lettuce or the tomatoes, whatever it would be. But there's a halacha that anything that's intact and whole, meaning if it's a fragment of an insect, which you always have, unfortunately, actually that's going to be nullified in 60. But if it's a whole little thing, that's why there's difference in smoothies, right? You may have heard sometimes if you have raspberry purees,
That's fine.
it's okay, because even if there are some insects there, I know it doesn't sound good, but it's a reality of life. Even if there's some insects there, they're pureed, and therefore they're nullified in 60, as opposed to when you're eating them whole, you might be eating a whole insect, even if it's small, and the laws of nullification of 60 do not apply when you have a whole insect. Now, apropos of the question you raised, so people, if I then ask, well, can I buy raspberries, which are insect infested, and can I deliberately decide to puree them,
Yes.
or is that considered deliberately creating nullification? So I think the short answer is, if you know they are insect infested, you would not be allowed to deliberately puree. But if you don't know and you just want to, so you're not doing it for nullification, you're doing it because you want a smoothie, then you would be allowed to benefit because you're not doing it deliberately for the benefit of nullification. Say again?
If you wash the fruit, can you assume that there's no insects on it?
You know, this is a little complicated. You really have to look at guidelines. You know, the OU has guidelines, the Star K has guidelines, the CRC of Chicago has guidelines, the Israeli hashgachos have guidelines. Plain washing for certain types of things is not enough. For some things it is. But for things like, I think for raspberries, they more or less say, don't have them at all. I mean, some things
A lot of people don't.
just give up.
Yeah.
Or with strawberries. Well, yes, that's what I'm saying. You could mash them as long as you don't know there are insects there. Like that's a puree. You know, they sometimes give you instructions for eating strawberries. I mean, by the time you go through what they tell you to cut away, you have like 1/10 of the strawberries. You've got to cut like a 1/4 inch from the top and 1/2 inch from the bottom, and on all 4 sides take something away. Like there's nothing left after you do it. You know, so the insect thing can be very, very difficult. Truth is, people are stricter than they have to be. And also Israel is unfortunately there is greater infestation because of the climate and the like. So sometimes you got to be a little more careful here.
Do they have like machines that you can put the raspberries in to kill the bugs? Or like UV?
Well, they say they actually say no. They actually say that frozen fruit, frozen berries, were generally processed in such a way that they spin them at very high speeds that dislodges the insect. and they say that that is better than fresh. That the frozen you can rely that have been adequately insect-free, which would not apply to fresh meat because commercially they can do things in factories that we're not able to. Okay. And then they also have special hothouses like broccoli. They have special brands that are said to be insect-free. Bodeg, certain brands. They're more expensive, but they're grown under greenhouse conditions, which they don't have any dirt. It's hydroponic or whatever it is. So there are no insects there. Okay. So that was. I just wanted to get into a basic understanding. Now, so we talked about basically two things about the Omer. We talked about the counting of the Omer, and we talked about the bringing of the Omer with the laws of Chadash. I want to talk about another aspect of the Omer, and that is the Omer as a time of Avelus, a time of mourning, a time of sadness. Right? Everybody knows, as soon as you become from, you're aware of the fact that this is a time of year in which we do not do certain things. We don't make weddings. We don't cut our hair. We don't listen to music, at least live music. Although, again, there are leniencies for recorded music, etc. But there are some restrictions. Now, the thing,
Does radio count as live music?
so radio is not live music, no. Radio is similar to recorded music.
So like the component of there being like a DJ who's like you're curating what's being played. That doesn't.
Live is only when there's an actual instrument.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that the mourning of the Omer was not originally the case. There is no intrinsic reason why this would be a sad period. If anything, this period would be a happy period. We're looking forward to Kabbalah Satorah. So the idea that the Shvira period becomes a sad period is very late. And it starts with a tradition, which we talked about last week, but I want to build on it a little bit, that this was the period of time in which the great Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students. An amazing thing. And they all died between Pesach and Shavuos. And the reason they died through a plague, but the spiritual reason they died is they did not show proper respect and regard for each other. And that resulted in a great, 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 great tragedy. So to this very day, we mourn the deaths of the students of Rabbi Akiva. Now, as I mentioned, people ask the question, well, 24,000 students, that's bad. Of course, that's a tragedy. But I mean, we've had the Holocaust, we've had much, much worse. Why am I so focused on the students of Rabbi Akiva? And the answer is very simple. If the issue would simply be mourning, yeah, you might as well say, let's mourn over the Holocaust. That's much worse. But the thing is, I don't have a reason for the Holocaust that's definitive. I can't say 6 million Jews died because. With Rabbi Akiva, I have a reason. So the purpose of the mourning of Sfira is not just to mourn, but to rectify, to fix. I have a reason. They didn't show kavod. So what is my lesson? To learn how to honor another Jew. This is very important. It's not just mourning. It's rectifying. It's deepen. Now, here is where life gets a little complicated. Chazal tell us they died in the period between Pesach and Shavuos. But it doesn't tell us exactly which days. So because of this, although everybody counts the Omer for 49 days, that's no machlokas there. But there's a huge number of opinions. What days are days of Avelis? What days do you mourn? And what days don't you mourn? Remember, that has nothing to do with the counting. The counting of the Omer is 49 days. But the Avelos, the mourning of the Omer, M-O-U-R, and I-N-G, will vary. So let me just mention a few of the customs. Many Kehilas have different customs. Custom number one, which is from the Arizal, is you actually go the whole period straight. From second day of Pesach to Erev Shavuos, you keep 49 days of mourning, with the exception of Lag BaOmer, which we'll talk about, as a hiatus. Lag BaOmer this year is Thursday night, Friday. So minhag number one is all the days except Lag BaOmer. We'll talk about why Lag BaOmer is special. Okay. Minhag number two. You start from the second day of Pesach until Lag BaOmer, and from Lag BaOmer on is mutter, meaning Lag BaOmer is not just a hiatus or a break, but when Lag BaOmer starts, that ends the Avelis, and you don't have to observe any mourning restrictions after Lag BaOmer. So you could make a wedding the 35th of the Omer, the 40th of the Omer, whatever it is. So minhag number two is second day of Pesach, up to, not including Lag BaOmer, Lag BaOmer on, everything is mutter. That's mutter is permitted. That is custom number two. Custom number three. You don't start the mourning during the month of Nisan, meaning during Chol HaMoed, during Pesach, even after Pesach, you can listen to music, you can make weddings. You start the mourning Rosh Chodesh Iyar. Rosh Chodesh Iyar has 2 days of Rosh Chodesh, and you go until 3 days before Shavuos. Those are the 3 days where we prepare for the Torah. So that would mean your mourning is observed from the first day of Rosh Chodesh Iyar until 3 days before Shavuos. But again, with Lag BaOmer as a break. I'll review it quickly. Minhag number 4, you start after the 2 days of Rosh Chodesh Iyar. So you're starting 2 days later. So you make it up by going until Erev Shavuos, meaning you do continue the mourning for 2 days of the 3 days. And Lag BaOmer is your hiatus. I'm not sure, have I mentioned 4? How many customs have I mentioned? 4? 4. Let me go over it again, the 4 customs. Custom number 1 is the Arizal, 49 days of mourning, except for Lag BaOmer. That's the Arizal. Minhag number 2, from second day of Pesach, continuous, until Lag BaOmer, and from Lag BaOmer onwards is permitted. Minhag number 3, start Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the first of the 2 days Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and go until 3 days before Shavuos, with Lag BaOmer as a hiatus. And minhag number 4 is start after the 2 days Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and go until the day before Shavuos, Erev Shavuos, with Lag BaOmer as a break. So in all 4 minhagim, Lag BaOmer is at least a break. And according to one minhag, Lag BaOmer ends it. According to all the other customs, Lag BaOmer is a break. Now there is a 5th minhag of many Sephardim, which is quite unusual. And this is the only minhag in which they do not regard Lag BaOmer as having a special role here. And they say, you start from the second day of Pesach, and you go through Lag BaOmer not getting a haircut, and then it's mutter after. It's mutter only from the 34th day of the Omer, which means Lag BaOmer is the last day of the morning, and there's actually no heter for Lag BaOmer itself. Okay, so these are many, many, many different minhagim, and different communities have different minhagim. But here is the question I want to raise with you, a very, very fascinating question. Let's imagine, let's take two examples. Let's imagine that you're a person who keeps Sfira. Your minhag is from second day of Pesach until Lag BaOmer. Okay, that's what you do. Your friend invites you to their wedding, which is right after Pesach, and for them it's okay because they don't start their Sfira minhagim until Rosh Chodesh or after Rosh Chodesh. In other words, my question is, you're invited to a wedding which is not during the mourning period of the chassan and the kala, but it is during your mourning period. Are you allowed to go to that wedding? Meaning it's svira, I'll use the way people talk. It's really not, it's svira either way, but we often call it svira when we refer to the mourning period. It's your svira mourning, but it's not their svira mourning. You're invited to the wedding. Are you allowed to go? So Rav Moshe Feinstein has a very interesting tshuva. This is what he says. It's really a very ingenious psak. Rav Moshe Feinstein argues there is actually no prohibition to go to a wedding during the Omer. The prohibition is to get married during the Omer. So as long, now, if the chassan and the kala would be violating the law against getting married, you shouldn't go because you're encouraging them to sin. That's true. But if the chassan and the kala are allowed to get married, because for them it's not a mourning period, you are allowed to go. This is actually a very interesting observation. There is no direct prohibition against going to a wedding. The only prohibition is getting married. Now, the only thing is, well, wait a second. Maybe that's true about going to a wedding, but there is a prohibition against listening to live music. So how can I go to the wedding if I'm going to be listening to live music? So on that, Rav Feinstein says that since there's a great, great mitzvah to rejoice with a chassan and a kala, that great mitzvah will override the prohibition. Meaning, yeah, you're right, you don't listen to live music, but if you're going to a wedding, you're allowed to. And he also says another thing, that you could get a haircut. Now, if a person needs a haircut for whatever reason, for this mitzvah, they would be allowed to get a haircut as well. So the main chiddush, the main innovation of Rav Feinstein's psak is there is no autonomous, independent avera in going to a wedding if it is a permissible wedding for the chassan and the kala. If, on the other hand, they are violating, let's say they're not religious, they're violating the Sfira laws, you generally should not go because it's not the same. It's like going to an intermarriage. I mean, not really. It's not as severe as an intermarriage. But the same way, you wouldn't go to an intermarriage because it's a sinful union. You don't want to celebrate it. I don't mean to compare it. It's very different. But on a much lesser degree, you don't go to a marriage in violation of Sfira because it's against halacha. But as long as it's mutter for them, you're allowed to be a guest. That's what Moshe Feinstein's chiddush about that. Yeah.
Can you go to a non-Jewish wedding? Like just two non-Jewish?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, so I think it may be a problem because of the music primarily. Meaning, if I'm an Orthodox Jew during Sfira and I'm invited to a non-Jewish wedding, am I allowed to go? So I would say there's no problem with going to the wedding, but there is a problem with the live music. So that would be something to consider. Yeah, maybe go to the ceremony. Yeah. That would be okay. Okay, so these are some ins and outs about Sphira. Now, another thing that's interesting, though, people will ask you the question, well, you're telling me we don't listen to live, many people don't even listen to recorded music, but I'm just mentioning live. You don't listen to live music during Sphira. Show me where the Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to listen to music during the Omer period. So your initial reaction is, well, it's got to be there because everybody knows you don't do that. But I'll tell you, take it on trust. You can look and look and look and look and look. You will find it nowhere. There will be no place whatsoever where it says you can't listen to music during Sphira. Aha! So your interlocutor will triumphantly say to you, you see, you're allowed to do it. Well, not really. Let me explain something. The Shulchan Aruch actually rules that you're not allowed to listen to music the whole year in mourning for the destruction of the temple. So the Shulchan Aruch had no reason to mention don't listen to music during the Omer period, because the Shulchan Aruch actually says you're not supposed to listen to music anytime. Now, for various reasons, we obviously do not follow that strict view. And that's why we are strict 2 times a year, during the Omer period, and the same issue with during the 3 weeks in the summer that commemorate the destruction of the temple. Neither of which are found in the Shulchan Aruch. But you understand why. The Shulchan Aruch had no reason to separate out the Omer or the 3 weeks. But we do, because we do listen to music the rest of the year. People then ask different things. Well, what about, so live music is not good, recorded music, best not to, but if you need it for exercise, or you're doing work and you can't focus without the music, so we are relatively lenient on those uses of music, but preferably it should be with headphones, and it shouldn't be like a public music blaring out or the like. And certainly if someone is depressed or anxious and the music soothes them, so we would certainly be very, very lenient. Now there's another issue. They have a lot of recordings that are a cappella. These are without instruments. So some say, well, listen, if you're listening to a recording, what's the difference? I mean, it's a recording, so what's the difference if it's instruments or vocal? But some do allow a cappella music, and these are called Sphira tapes. You can get, they're made for Sphira a cappella. So there are different leniencies here, meaning once we move beyond the live concert, so we have leniencies, a cappella recordings, we have exercise recordings, tension recordings. There are different ways of leniency. And people also ask, can I take music lessons? Can I give music lessons? Can I take music lessons? Meaning where I actually play an instrument. And the general rule here is, halachically, that if it's basic instruction, the person is not playing full compositions, just kind of the basic practice of scales or whatever it would be, that is mutter. But once the person is good enough that he could actually play a musical piece, that's better to avoid during the Omer period.
But can you practice as long as, if you do have the ability to play these longer, more elaborate pieces, could you still practice the basics?
Yeah, you can always practice the basics. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's about it. I think for the Omer.
If you were a professional musician, would it be an exception?
So once again, this is very much connected. If you are playing at non-Jewish events, and that's your job, so you're allowed to do your job, and you're allowed to practice whatever you need for your job. If, on the other hand, you're a professional musician and you're being hired by Jewish people, which they're not allowed to do, then you're not allowed to work for them. So it kind of
And like
depends.
no claim for like pleasure. Like it would
And no
be
claim
fair
for
job.
pleasure, right. But you can do what's necessary for your job as long as what you're doing is permitted for the people that are hiring you. So they're non-Jews or whatever it
Is
is.
that the same for any job though?
The what?
Like you can't be hired to do something that is not.
Yeah. It's the same. It's the same principle. It's the same principle. You shouldn't do things that are sinful for the person that's hiring you. Okay, so we'll separate. So I think the next thing we'll do, since actually this was a little bit of a segue, we talked a lot about kashrus laws here. So maybe we'll talk a few weeks about the laws of meat and milk, just an area that might be useful. Is that useful to you?
Of course.
Okay, so a little bit of kashrus for a while. Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.